be things that we could be doing at this point that could make a difference. So I think if we just turn our attention there for a second to what the market is currently indicating, and what I did is I sort of just collected some of the latest indicators that we actually have, and I want to stop it up there at the top right hand corner actually. Now I can't see that well because my bar is hiding and it doesn't escape at the moment. But as you can see that our national picture has changed quite a lot in the first quarter specifically, where we're down quite considerably on value, 6%. Number of units are down for the first quarter. In total, just from the period of the lockdown itself, we're talking about April, there's a 65% down on units, bond applications, and that's down 68% on value down on bond applications specifically. And your finance applications is always a really good impression on what the market is actually doing at the moment. So all in all, First National Bank Property Barometer is indicating a potential 45% contraction in the number of transactions in the near future predicted for the next year, as a matter of fact. The FNB House Price Index is showing the slowest growth in the past 10 years. The gross domestic national product is predicted to contract by between 7 and 10%. Shall I continue with the bad news? There's a projected 750,000 Rand formal job losses due to the lockdown itself, and an unemployment already rose to roughly about 29% at the end of last year. And in the meantime, South Africa had 2 credit downgrades to junk status for our economy at the time. So I've just sort of shared the bad news just relating to our economy, but you hardly need a genie to tell you this. You just have to switch the TV on at night to realize that our economy is not in the greatest form at the moment. However, on the one hand, you have this situation, you have the situation with real estate per se that's losing some of its momentum in terms of growth and value. But on the other hand, there are some good, excellent things to look forward to as well, on which we pin a lot of our faith and hope. The lower interest rate means that buyers can actually buy up to a few 100,000 Rand up in a market like this. So as the market is showing the changes, it really gives opportunity for other people again, and the lower interest rate will be one of those things that will help a lot. The weaker Rand has made it possible for our overseas investors and European buyers to actually even buy at higher price brackets. And if in the past they could have bought a 12.5 million Rand property for the euro, they can now pick that same property up for roughly about 9 million Rand, just as the way that the Rand is weakened against the euro and the dollar, etc. It's a very favorable lending climate at the moment from our banks. They are competitive. They stay in business by also lending out money. So they are definitely competing against one another. And I believe, and as a team at Harcourts Platinum, we believe that this demand will be well equipped to buy when the lockdown is over. As a matter of fact, in our team, we have concluded about 9 transactions during lockdown, just showing that people have appetite, people have to move, there are changes taking place in people's lives, and the market is still alive and well, but not on the same, let's call it, principles that maybe it was 18 months ago. But the real estate market is still around. So maybe just a few things around what we believe is, how do we measure what is the state of the real estate market? You know, in this period of COVID and so forth, you have many times have a patient on the bed, and when the doctor comes in, he's looking for, let's call it, the symptoms, and he's looking for indicators of what state the patient is in. So he'll take his blood pressure, blood sugar, heart rate, etc. And that sort of gives him an indication of what needs to happen next, how stable this is, what do we need to do. A real estate market has about the same kind of, let's call it, indicators. And I think the most predictable ones that we could look at is what's currently for sale. We want to look at number of days in the market, which is one of the main concerns for a seller. And it's normally a good indication of what happened in the market 18 months ago, what's happening right now. Absorption ratio, I'll explain that in a second. And then the list to sales price ratio. These are all symptoms of the market that tells us what condition the market is in right now versus maybe some time ago, and it will be some time in the future. So just to quickly touch on that, I think the most important one for me is really the one concerning the 30% less transactions done during the past 6 months measured against the same period a year ago. So there we definitely seen a softening of the market, less transactions busy happening, and that obviously have an influence on how quickly you could sell, what you could get in your pocket. Number of days in the market 18 months ago was 110 days on average in the Helderberg market specifically, but that has now moved up to roughly about 180 days in the market. So we're sitting roughly at about 6 months on average, meaning that some properties can take 90 days to sell, other people can take a year to sell. So even although we're talking about these average indicators, one's got to keep in mind that specific properties, based upon the motivation, the pricing, the location, the presentation, and the condition of the property, can still defeat the averages. So people do have control over beating the odds on many of the KPIs I'm reading out to you. However, if we average it out, and maybe we take bad decisions about our property and our property sales process, then you can very easily become part of the statistics by falling into these, let's call it averages basically, which wouldn't suit your pocket nor your time frame basically. An absorption ratio per quarter specifically means that not all the property in that you see with a for sale board in front of them actually sells. So in a better market, we had 38% 18 months ago of the available properties in an average neighborhood that will actually sell in a quarter, while currently it's roughly about 28% per quarter on average in the South African market and the Helderberg specifically that actually sells. So you'll notice that 10% less available properties actually move within a quarter. Just the first quarter of 2020, because that's an annual figure, the first quarter of 2020 has seen that figure drop to an average of only 20%. So only a fifth of all the properties that you see available in the average suburb actually has a successful sale and a transfer. Last statistic here is your list to sales price ratio. And in a better market 18 months ago, that figure sat at 93%, meaning that a seller asked a specific price and they got 93% on average of the asking price. In a market such as the one we're currently in that's measured over the past few months, that has dropped down to 87% of the asking price they would get as a sales offer. We've even seen some properties during the lockdown period itself, which is April and now part of May, that had only achieved 70% of asking price. But on average, it's currently 87%, especially in the Helderberg market that I'm referring to. And folks, keep in mind that every suburb could have a different list to sales price ratio and an absorption ratio, depending on location, amenities, local schools, desirability of the kind of properties, older properties, newer properties, supply in that particular market. So I've just averaged these figures out to give you an indication of what is important, and that gives us an indication of what kind of market we are currently in. So I think that's as I mentioned before, you can still beat the odds on the averages by basically choosing the correct price on your property, making it more attractive for a sale, looking at the presentation and condition of the property. Those things may beat the odds. So in a market as this, the one that we're currently in, which I've given you a little bit of background from the economy and the real estate condition itself, one should really have a high motivation to sell. This is not the time to come into the market and think, let me test it, let me see what I can get. Can we start a bit higher to see if there's, let's leave some room for negotiation. This would be a really, really frustrating, disappointing, and a time-consuming experience if we approach the real estate market like this at the moment. If you're highly motivated with strong reasons to sell, it's important that you realize that when you choose an agent then to market your property, that you understand that you are going into a partnership with that agent. And it's not the marketing company or your agent's sole responsibility to actually get your property sold. You have such a big role to play as a seller to see a successful marketing process come about. So just to very, very quickly touch on that, if you do employ an agent to work for you, you've got to understand that the seller is always in charge of the pricing. He listens to advice, feedback from the market, feedback from buyers, and the seller is the one deciding on the initial list price, as well as what happens to pricing throughout the marketing period. Another thing that the seller is in charge of is presentation and condition of the property. And the ideal words that one would like to use here is you want to take a property from living condition to showing condition. So many times the whole thing has got to be upped a little bit. It's got to be presented better. It's got to be decluttered. And your agent could really advise you on what to do but the seller is still the one that has to effect all those things to make the property attractive, saleable, and let other people see themselves living in there. I think a seller has got to be able to give access to the property. The property's got to be accessible, especially if you've got tenants in it, and the seller's got to be cooperative, bending over backwards sometimes for an appointment. And then I think that the seller has to stay flexible and negotiable on the pricing issue, meaning that if you're in this particular market and the current set of circumstances we're in, is still of the opinion, say, unless I can get X amount in my pocket, I won't sell. I think that that becomes a very dangerous mindset to cling onto. In this market, if you can't go beyond particular points and you start getting the feedback, rather withdraw from the market, see what other plans you can make, and wait for a more favorable time. And with that, we're saying that the market is alive and well. People are buying real estate, but they're buying it on new terms than necessarily the terms that you have to offer as a seller in this market. The agent's job is to advise on the market conditions, who you're competing against, price recommendations possibly, but the seller is the one making the choice. The agent is the one that's got to give you a marketing plan, implement the marketing plan, promote the property, advertise and expose the property to as many buyers, qualified buyers as they can, feedback to the seller continually so that the seller can adapt to the market demand and conditions. That's the purpose of the feedback, is for the seller to take new actions and new decisions about his pricing, about the presentation, and about the condition of the property, basically. And that's where the seller's role is huge and a non-negotiable role in order to participate in selling the property. I think creating competition between buyers is an agent's main job, and then taking offers and facilitate and negotiate between the parties are definitely the things that it's part of the agent's domain to effect. But I'm sure that you can all see that the seller has a major role to play in the marketing and the sale of his property, obviously. So if we come to this point where you have had an interview with an agent or you have been dealing with an agent already, obviously you start understanding that the seller is the one choosing a price here. You're the one making decisions about pricing. And what we find lots of times, as a matter of fact, in the majority of cases with sellers, is that the seller arrives at a price based upon the following few, let's call it motivations. And we know that from an agent's perspective, we many times hear sellers saying to us, we need to get X amount of rand out because we have to invest something for pension. We might have to pay off debt. I'll only break even. I bought it for so much and now I have to sell in a hurry. So I can't afford to make a loss. They're saying to us, we are moving to a more expensive area, so I got to get X amount from this home that I'm busy selling. Or we've spent so much rand on improvements, for instance, so unless I make this money back, I would have overcapitalized on the property. Or my neighbor sold for maybe so much rand a year ago, hence I got to get that amount of money out. So with the same challenge arrive when a seller indicates that they absolutely have to get X amount in their pocket, add the cost on top of that, and voila, we have a selling price. Now, our empathy and sympathies are always deeply with our sellers who's in a particular bind and who absolutely have to sell and who needs a particular amount of money out. But sadly, none of these motivations holds any water where the forces of supply and demand and market value is at play. So whatever we are selling, we have to heed the concept of market value. And let's just stand still with that for 1 or 2 minutes, because I do believe as property is a very personal possession, we tend to forget that we are competing against other commodities such as other properties, and that buyers are shopping, they're making comparisons, and we as sellers are subject to also competing against other sellers. So let's chat for just a few minutes about market value and supply and demand to show you how we should be making decisions about our property in terms of arriving at market value. So up here I'm saying that market value is really a function or a result of a specific set of economic circumstances, socio-political at a given time. Left-hand corner, you see London, the streets of London, 1945. Hitler is bombing the hell out of London there. There's hardly a building standing. Everybody's living underground. So in that specific set of socio-political and economic circumstances, what do we believe a property was worth in London at that time? Maybe you probably even couldn't give it away at the time. A different set of economic circumstances and socio-political development, look at London today, and you can hardly afford to buy anything there. So the value is a function of what's happening and the environment and circumstances around a product, a service, or a property for that matter. Look at oil, for instance, at the moment, low demand for fuel, low demand for oil, and oil prices has taken a massive plunge in the past few weeks with COVID. We've seen our petrol prices coming down because of the low demand for it. So we can clearly see that value or price is like any other product, is driven by the set of economic and social and political circumstances that is driving that. And I believe that really proves the point in the same for the property market. There's a number of different definitions from market value that will all come to about roughly the same thing. And if I can put it to you this way, it could probably sound something along the following lines. The price that a willing and able buyer is willing to pay a willing and able seller in an open and a competitive market, given a certain set of economic, political, and social factors, basically. So the value is not just what we believe as sellers we need to get out. It's actually what a buyer who's qualified and able to buy is willing to offer, and it comes through a negotiation process. But if a buyer walks away, then obviously you know what market value was by the mere fact that you had a particular offer from him, or maybe 2 or 3 offers on the same thing. So currently we're very firmly in a buyer's market where you can see that more properties is for sale than what buyers are currently looking for. Properties will automatically take longer to sell. You've seen it in our times on the market from 110 days to 180 days. And seller lower their prices to sell. You've seen that in the list to sales price ratio, we dropped from 93% to 87%, which gives you an indication that sellers lower their prices in order to actually sell. So currently we are in a buyer's market. They are in charge, and there's quite a lot of stock, obviously, available in the market at the moment. So I think if I just move over here. So let's say, for instance, how would I establish market value on my property? And I think there are three or four different things that we can do. The number one thing that I think we should be looking at is competitors' pricing. So I just took a random suburb here in the Helderberg area. It's called Rome Glen. And what you'll note is there are 3-bedroom homes for sale here in Rome Glen for 2.995, 2.7, 2.980, 2.950. And then there's a 4-bedroom for 3.390. So here you can clearly see that the competitor's price will have a major influence on the decision-making of the seller. If you have a seller in Rome Glen that has a 3-bedroom home who wants to put it in the market at the price of a 4-bedroom, let's say for 3.4 million rand, chances are that many buyers that would have seen that property, that should have seen it, will only be looking up to the 3 million rand because that's where the competition is pricing at. And if a seller then takes a decision to put his property, his 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom home in the market at 3.4 million rand, because he spent too much money on improvements, because he financed a car, because he wants to maybe utilize the money as part of his pension plan, etc., that probably will just stay in the market for a year, 18 months, 2 years possibly, until many of the competitors have sold and the market might have grown into the price expectation that the seller has. And as you could have seen from our initial slides, at the moment, the market is still softening, it's going down, although there are sellers who are busy buying property, obviously. So what happens when a seller lists his property in the market? And I think this is actually quite a revelation if one doesn't work with that every single day. But I'm going to just use a property here as an example in Pintail Road. Here we had a seller that listed his property and he left some room for negotiation. He listed at 2,995. And 18 months later, he sold for 2,530. Now, there's a very specific reason why this is happening, and I've got reams of examples, and so probably just most of real estate agents that you ever work with can tell you the same story over and over. The summary of the story is that the longer a property stays in the market, the more its value diminishes over time and eventually selling for less than what it could have achieved within the initial crucial listing period with a high qualified buyer interest. So to give you an indication, this over here would be listing day, argument's sake, first day in the market. Market value is what a willing buyer is willing to pay, a willing and able buyer is willing to pay a seller in an open negotiated transaction over here. And we are busy talking about how do we establish what this market value for property is. So I don't underprice my property, but neither do I want to overprice it and wait too long to sell it and maybe miss my deadlines that I have. So what you have is when a property gets listed on day one, you have got most qualified buyers who gets emailed by the property portals, agents call them, they get notifications by websites and saying there's a new property for sale. And by this time, the buyers in this group over here has seen all other property in the suburb. They've been shopping for 6 months or a year. They might have made some offers. They might have lost some offers, etc. And these qualified buyers are the ones that are the first responders to a new property coming into the market. Normally, when a seller gets an offer within the first 3 to 4 weeks over here, that is, in most cases, his best offer and many times his last offer for quite a number of months to come. Because when this group of buyers moved on, they've seen the property in Rome Glen for 3.4 million rand, a brand new property in the market. It should have been in the market for maybe 2.9, and they lose interest. It's too far out of for their negotiation. Maybe they don't want to make an offer, etc., and they move on. So in this property in Pintail Road, within the first 3 to 4 weeks, we had an offer for 2,650. The seller declined, thinking that maybe he's going to get more over a period of time. After a few weeks, he dropped the price to 2,895 with 100K. Another few weeks, months 2, 3, 4 later, he dropped the price to 2,700, eventually to 2,595. And 18 months down the line, the seller sold for 2,530, close on to more over 100,000 rand less than what he could have gotten 18 months ago. And this is a very predictable picture and a story in real estate due to this very high market demand that we have at the beginning here and losing that initiative. And this would be a way where the seller would have realized that that offer for 2,650 was market value for his property, as this competitive buyer has been looking at that property and comparing that property against other properties of the same. So the property's market value actually diminished over a period of time as the seller has turned down that, and people thinking, wow, there's something wrong with it. One of the first questions they normally ask an agent is, why have they been in the market so long? How long has this property been in the market? And we can use many, many examples to explain that. I'm nearly done with my little story before I'm going to hand over to Michael. What we're busy talking about is in this market where there's very little information available of what the market value of my property should be, where the deeds office has been closed for 2 months now, when the last property transaction that was actually sold is only registered is 4 months old already, our historical data on property pricing doesn't count for much at the moment. It's outdated. Our circumstances has drastically changed of our economy, the way that our property economy is working, etc. So what are the tools and resources we can use right now in order to establish market value? And I've said to you that the first thing that we could do is look at what competitors are pricing, like the Rome Glen example, understanding how this works. The second thing that we could do is look at the absorption ratio in your local market. So in other words, an absorption ratio, which we touched on before, can be done 2 ways. It could either be done in the suburb that you're in, or it could be done across a price bracket. So in other words, you list between the 3 and the 4 million rand mark, or between the 1 and the 2 million rand mark, and you can have a look at how many properties are competing with my property in that price band. And then we establish the absorption ratio. Here I've just chosen Helderview, which is a suburb. Last night I chose the suburb in Helderview here in the Helderberg area in Somerset West. And you'll see that there are currently 53 properties for sale in the market. Here on the left-hand side of the screen, it shows Helderview, 53 properties for sale. And during the past 3 months, just before lockdown, 6 of them is actually sold, or rather registered. So the information is already a little bit older, but it gives us a good indication. That means that the market only absorbs 11% of the available properties in a quarter. So that gives you 2 properties per month. So if there are 53 properties for sale, only 2 of them are selling. It will take some sellers 26 months to actually sell their property. So here, if a seller doesn't choose a market-related price for his property and cooperate on the condition and the presentation of his property, he could easily wait 2 years or more to sell the property, provided that no new properties actually come into the market. So understanding what the absorption ratio in your suburb or your price band is gives you a really good indication on how competitively you should be pricing, or if there's any margins that you can wait a few months, or that you can try the market, or that you can list with a bit of fat on so that you can negotiate. In this market, you've got to have high motivation. We've got to price correctly, and we establish our market value by these methods that we're now talking about. Sorry for flipping through my screens. I would love to hand over to Michael to talk about a third and a fourth principle about establishing market value, which is a bidding to start from price principle, part of our non-distress auctions. And he will explain the balance of this little presentation on establishing market value and how to follow a marketing plan in a market like the one that we currently have. Michael, thank you. Over to you. And everybody, thanks for listening thus far. I see you haven't left yet. As a matter of fact, a few people have joined us. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks ever so much. So a lot of people tend to ask us why we're looking at non-distressed auctions. It's something as a company that we've been doing very regularly now for probably close to 3 years. So if I can just ask Jan just to go to the next slide. A lot of people are saying to us, you know, what's the reason? Why are we looking at auctions, etc.? As I said, first of all, we've been doing it as a company for 3 years. But as probably most of you know, Harcourts is in America, we're in Australasia. The companies there have been going for many, many years. And it's a product that they've used to great success as well. So we followed a lot of the models that they've had. So the question is, a lot of people tend to ask, how does it work? Well, first of all, there's a live auction deadline for bids to be in by. So the process is very, very simple. There's a deadline that people would have in order to be able to make a bid. And that period is normally a marketing period of about 4 weeks from when the initial mandate is signed. So if, for example, a client was to sign a mandate today, then we'd probably be looking at an anticipated date of maybe somewhere in the region of the 6th of June for that auction date to actually happen. The beauty is that because obviously we're a real estate firm as well as an auction company, we have absolutely no problem if a client wants to make an offer prior to that particular auction day. So if a client comes along and they say to us, you know, look, can I make a normal offer to purchase rather than bid at auction? That's something that we would encourage. We would strongly recommend them to be able to do that. The benefit for the seller, well, quite simply, is the buyer is fully aware that if the seller is going to stop the auction and they're going to say, well, look, based on this offer, I'm going to cancel the auction, then of course that buyer understands that their offer has got to be market related. One of the big advantages that we found over perhaps a price listing that we might have is a client will come along, they'll see the home, they'll fall in love with the home, and all of a sudden now there's a deadline that they've got to make a decision by because the auction's coming up. Whereas often with a price listing, we might not be able to have that competitiveness, should I say, in order for the client to have to make a bid by a certain date. And as I'll show maybe later, a good example of that on one of our slides. Sometimes the seller says to us, well, you know, am I still in control, you know, of the process? Well, absolutely, because the third step is that you as the seller would have a non-disclosed reserve price. So just as a price listing, you're absolutely not under any obligation whatsoever to accept an offer that you don't think would be an offer that would be acceptable to you. The fourth step, and this is where we've had a slight change to our previous auctions that we've done over the years, especially during the lockdown period and the change in the market. In huge discussions and long discussions that we've had with Harcourts USA and Harcourts Australia, where they've used a bidding to start from price. So instead of price on application, we'll put it in with a bidding to start from price. Now, why do we do that? Well, there's two key reasons that they follow that particular strategy. Number one is, as with any auction, you start somewhere and then the bids will go up and up and up. So it's not something that's new. We would expect the bids to be a lot higher than the start from bidding price. But one of the benefits is when the auction actually happens, we don't start at a ridiculously low figure and have to take a long period of time to work it up in the auction and lose people's interest. So first of all, there's a figure that we would actually start from. The second big advantage to that bidding start from price is if it's attractive enough to the buyers, then the buyers will start phoning, whereas perhaps they wouldn't have even thought about phoning before. So for a seller, what the seller always wants is the maximum amount of buyers through a home, because if the buyer can go through the home and fall in love with a home, then maybe they'll make an offer. But if they don't go through the home and they can't see the home and they've dismissed the home because perhaps the price is something that's maybe initially what they thought was out of their range, then they don't have that emotion that they need in order to be able to increase their budget and buy the property. So even from before, when we did the auctions without a bidding to start from price, we've noticed, and you'll see the statistics in a minute, that our number of inquiries are that much higher. So just to give you an example, if we go on to the next slide, this is a home that we had on the market for a period of 3 weeks before the lockdown actually commenced. And this is a beautiful home. If there's any buyers on the system, strongly encourage you to have a look at this property. I think our seller might even be here as well, so they'd be delighted to be able to get this property sold. So we had a small number of clients that were having a look at this property on the price listing. In fact, on average, maybe about 5 a day. So we made the decision to switch this to a non-distressed auction to be able to get the property out so that more buyers would be able to see it. Now, as you can see here, when it came through on approximately the 26th of April, those buyer inquiries stepped up to about 30 a day instead of 5. Now, this is just on our Harcourts website. But if we click through to the next slide, this shows the same property on one of our big property portals. So with a fixed asking price, we had on one property portal 772 views. We had 2 leads that came through over a period of 3 weeks. We then loaded it as a bidding to start from non-distressed auction. And these figures are something that I'm seeing on nearly all of the properties that are switching over to this method. So this isn't just a one-off. But we had 1,980 views on this property and 20 leads in a third of the time over a period of just 7 days. So we may think, well, you know, that's great, people are viewing the property, but what's the big advantage for the seller? Well, I can assure you that as an agent, and as all of our agents, well, a great deal of time should I spend is trained on negotiations. The problem is we can only negotiate when we have a client that gets in contact with us and a client that sees the property. Once we have that inquiry, it's then our job to be able to do the negotiations. And we've been to many training seminars in order to be able to get market value at the very, very best price for our seller. So if I have 20 leads to be able to negotiate with, as opposed to just 2, then our ability as an agent to be able to get the very best price for our seller is that much higher. Now, just to move over to an example of how this goes about and how this happens. The next slide is something that certainly is interesting for me as an agent to be able to have the ability to do this for our sellers. Now, just to give you an idea, when I last had a look on one property portal site, in a price range of 2.5 to 4 million in Somerset West, there were 481 homes listed on just one property portal site, 481. So how do we make our seller's property stand out from the crowd when there is potentially 481 homes that they can choose from? Now, they might change their criteria, put freestanding instead of security estates, or they might put in different areas, whatever it might be. So those numbers might be a bit lower, but literally there can be hundreds of homes for people to choose from. What we found is with this particular process, it makes the property stand out in the crowd. So if there's a buyer that's out there that could potentially buy your home, What we do know is with this process, they will definitely see it, and they're not going to pass it on. And the likelihood of them inquiring, as we saw previously, is about 10 times more than if we were to do it on a price listing. Those statistics we can clearly see. So the benefit for the seller of having their property stand out in the crowd is so much different. And that's through marketing, that's through the strategy that's being utilized on their particular home. And when we see those number of inquiries through, we can see that without doubt, that's absolutely a fact. One example of this was when I got in contact with Harcourt's South Africa auction company, and the guy that runs that, very proficient agent, and they did an auction on a golf estate in Benoni. And I think I've got the pronouncing right. I might be wrong because as an Englishman, it's sometimes hard to pronounce, but I think it was called Ebotsi or Ebosti golf estate. So the seller had had his property on the market for nearly 2 years, and he hadn't had an offer on it. And he felt as though his house was probably worth somewhere in the region of around 8 million. And the agent felt that because of the decline in the market, that maybe it was somewhere in the low sevens, perhaps around 7 million. So they decided that because market value is difficult to find in a declining market, that they would let the market decide as to the value. So they put it on a non-distressed auction platform with a bidding to start from price of 5.8. Now, to give you an idea, as I mentioned, there's 135 properties at the time for sale just in that one golf estate. So why wasn't he getting an offer? Because his house wasn't standing out in the crowd. There were so many to choose from. But as soon as they changed it over and they changed the marketing to this, the number of inquiries went dramatically through the roof, to the point that when I last spoke to him, they were sitting with a cash offer of 7 million on a bidding to start from price of 5.8, where they'd had no offers in nearly 2 years. So when we look at the benefits of the auction for our sellers, a few of those I think we've perhaps clearly mentioned. But the second thing is the sellers are, as we know, are realistic. And a lot of them are at the stage where they turn around and they say, look, we want to get our property sold. But as an agent, we can only give you the information that we have to hand. And the more information that we've got to be able to give you as a seller, the better it is for you. Now, when Jan looked at that previous graph near the beginning of his presentation with homes that were on the market and then the price drops, and the price drops, that's something that we see on a regular basis, and why some homes can be on the market for many, many months. But if we get so many more inquiries on your home, and perhaps many, many more buyers that are going through, all of that information that might take 6 to 9 months to be able to collate and give to you so you can make an informed decision is now condensed to perhaps a period of maybe 4 or 5 weeks. Why is that? Well, we're attracting more buyers are seeing it. They know that there's a deadline that they must inquire by, so they're making an inquiry much earlier in the process than they would before, and you're getting all of that information in which to make an informed decision as to what you want to do. Now, that decision might be, look, we're fine as we are. It might be, I can see that the price isn't where I thought it would be. And it might be, well, if that is the case, then maybe I should rather rent it. But what we do know is that you'll get the information much sooner so that property doesn't become stale on the market. The third aspect, as we mentioned at the beginning, is you are still completely in control of that process. So you get the information, you set your reserve price based on that information, and certainly there's no obligation just to accept an offer that might be the highest offer that's available at that time. So just moving on to the next slide for a moment. A lot of people tend to ask us, you know, is it all about the auction day as to whether it's a success or not? Well, with traditional auction firms, that's absolutely the case, because the property is either sold at auction or it's not sold at auction. The beauty of this particular auction and what we've seen in America and Australia and here in South Africa is because there's now a real estate firm that's conducting this auction, there's 3 steps to it instead of just one. The first step is that you can sell your home prior to auction if the offer is good enough, and we explained that earlier. There's the auction day itself where the property can sell, but there's also a third aspect to it, and that is post-auction. Now, to give you an idea, approximately statistically wise, 25% of properties are sold prior to auction, around 25% are sold on auction, and you're looking at around 50% that are sold post-auction. So without that third phase, you're really cutting your market down severely. So you might say, well, why is there a large percentage that's post-auction? Well, the simple answer is that there might be a number of inquiries, and we will let you know because we'll have that information, where people are interested in the property, but perhaps for one reason or another, they can't bid under the auction terms of sale. And that is a completely unconditional bid. So it might be that they're busy getting their finances organized. It might be that their house hasn't quite registered yet and they need the funds to be able to move across onto your property. But whatever it is, we might well know, or we will know that information. And that's why perhaps we can look at postponing the auction for a little while to allow those buyers to get their house in order and be able to bid on the property. So to give you a couple of examples, because obviously the proof is always in the pudding, so to speak, as to how these 3 steps have happened before. The top right-hand one is a property that's sold before auction. Now, to give you the information here, this was a home that we had on the market for about 4 months. And it was when the market started to decline quite radically. So you do all of your market analysis and you're looking at statistics from maybe 3-6 months ago, and that market has changed. And it looked like a certain figure on that property would be there or thereabouts. And there were viewings, no offers. The client decided to drop the price. There were viewings, there were no offers. So this went on for about a period of 4 months. So we explained the process to them, and they said, well, look, we would love to know what the market value of this home is. Let's go through and let's have a look at the non-distressed auction platform. In 3 weeks on this one home, we had 26 inquiries. We had 17 inspections. Poor Kelly, who works for me, she was running through that door every day. And we had 4 offers on it, and it sold for what we can see now as absolute market value. The client was happy, the buyers were happy. It was a happy experience for all. But what was interesting with this sale is the client who bought it had looked at it a number of times, probably 4 or 5 times they'd been through to have a look. And they had a property that they had to sell in order to be able to buy this. But as the auction day approached, we were about 3 days away from auction, they didn't want to lose this house. So they decided that they would cash in on some of their investments, buy the house before auction and pay a good price for it. And then once their house is sold, they'll pay that back into their investments. And we rarely see that on a normal price listing unless there's perhaps 3 or 4 offers on the home. The one on the bottom left of your screen is one that went straight onto the non-distressed auction program. And the reason was not because he was desperate to sell in terms of finances, but he was going to Australia in a couple of months' time, and the property was needed to be sold. So we went through, did 4 weeks worth of marketing. It was on the market for 28 days. We had 29 inquiries on this home, 16 inspections, and 4 offers. Now, interestingly, with this home, the first bidding that came in on the auction day was at 5 million. And the bidding went up, and eventually the property sold for 7.2, which was spot on what his reserve was and what he was comfortable selling the property at. Then the third one, the bottom right-hand screen, was an example of a house that sold after auction. Now, the gentleman who bought this house, finally bought this house, he was in Durban in a golf estate called Mount Edgecombe, and he was relocating to this golf estate in Somerset West. The problem was he'd been paid a deposit on his home, but the property hadn't transferred. So he couldn't bid under the normal auction terms of sale. But he was the most interested client in it, and he was the one who was willing to pay the most. So naturally, we simply postponed the auction for a period of 4 weeks, allowing him an opportunity to make his bid unconditional. So it technically sold after the first auction date, but it was on for 60 days, 31 inquiries, 13 inspections, 3 offers, and it sold for absolutely spot on as to market value. So when we say that this is a system that is tried and tested, it's not just tried and tested in America and Australia and New Zealand. It's tried and tested in a market in South Africa, where if it's marketed right as a non-distressed auction, it's not a bank repossession, and it's done correctly, and we've learned from our offices in Australia and America, then we're in a situation to be able to get it right for our sellers. So that kind of takes care of the pricing. The market is there. That determines generally what the price would be in a relatively short space of time for our sellers. And then the next thing is really, it's over to us to get the marketing right. And that's where a lot of the technology comes in. You would have probably seen for a number of years now, we started off with virtual reality tours. Other agencies are also doing that now, which is excellent. It needed to be done. But with social media, YouTube videos, the kind of statistics we can produce, the database marketing, seeing how many people have inquired, all of this technology is now available at our fingertips, which again, we've been given from Australia and America to be able to make your property really stand out in the crowd. How successful is it? Well, we've even sold homes for 10.5 million to overseas clients just based on a virtual reality tour. So last year in September, we had somebody put an offer in based on the virtual reality tour in September. It transferred in December, and the first time they physically saw the house was only February the following year. So we know for sure that the technology works. It's a proven method, and that's why we thought maybe it might be something that if you are a seller and you're out there and you're looking for something different, maybe at least something to have a look at or perhaps consider or chat to your agent about at some stage.
Mike, if you can park it there for a sec, I've got 1 or 2 chats on here. Thank you for your input thus far. That was very interesting. I just want to quickly get this chat open here for us, and let's put the question out there, ladies and gents. We've used our time very effectively, seeing that we started late. I would understand it if you have to leave. Take a snapshot of our detail here. There's my email address. I will forward any questions to relevant agents who can answer you. If you want a recording of this video, we'll post it on our Facebook site for Harcourts Platinum, and we can mail it to you. If you just send me a mail to my email address, I'll send the recording of the video back to you straight away. No props at all. But let's have a quick look for those who would like to stay for a minute more on our webinar. If the rest of you want to or have to go for other commitments, we will understand. Let's just open that chat here very quickly. Chat. And there was a question, Michael, from Chris Voss. Can you share your recent experience of impact on price of not being able to view a property in person? What stage of lockdown will viewings be allowed? So Mike, if you can answer that question, or I can ask one of the other agents on our panel that I've seen it's attending that recently sold property, and so have you during lockdown. Would you care to answer it, Mike?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question, actually, because it's one that we were wondering ourselves. And I think what I have noticed is that with this particular method, we've been getting offers in without the people viewing the properties. And that would have been very, very difficult before. So obviously, in an ideal world, we would love to get people through the properties. On a lot of them, we had virtual reality tours done before the lockdown, which we were able to send to clients, which was a huge help. But we've seen a number where we've been able to turn around to them and say, look, at auction, it's got to be an unconditional bid. So you have to be happy in your mind that if you wanted to take it to auction, that you'd be happy to base it on the virtual reality tool. And we've had many that have done an offer based on that without any issue at all. But obviously, because of phase number 1, they do have the option that rather than go to auction, they can simply say, well, look, I'll make an offer to purchase and I want to make it subject to viewing after lockdown. Now, if that price is really good and the seller thinks, well, look, I think I would like to take this offer and I'll take my chance, then by all means, we can cancel the auction for the seller and we can take that offer subject to lockdown afterwards. But that would all be down to what the seller would decide to accept or not accept. But it has certainly worked without viewing properties as well.
Right. Thanks for that, Mike. So we have another question on the chat. We have specifically left out the auction day itself or the marketing after the auction day. But here is a question relating to auction day. Mike, can see that we have got Richard asking it. You would probably not mind answering. On auction day, can a buyer offer less than offer through start from value? Can you answer that for us?
Yeah, so no, they can't. Obviously, you've got your auction terms and conditions. And in those auction terms and conditions, we say that the bids have to start from a certain amount. That certain amount is generally under what the reserve price would be by the seller. And we would announce that once that reserve price is met, that the property is officially on the market. So it's a very transparent way of being able to do it. But what we don't want to do for the seller is start so low that it makes it very difficult for us to get where we need to get and to be productive on the day of auction.
Right on. Okay, I think that's a fair answer there, Mike. Thank you very much. Carla, to everyone, what is the typical age group of those that buy on auction? Your experience.
Me again?
Yeah, absolutely. You're the man.
Quite a wide range. Those who are sort of elderly will generally obviously want to go through and have a look at the property in person and maybe a little bit more traditional. But for example, that one in Ehrenvale, the gentleman was probably in his early 60s, mid 60s, very happy to go through the auction procedure. What you generally find is when buyers first phone, and this is what you want, is you want the buyers to be able to phone, they'll ask about how the process works. So as long as you explain the process properly to them, and you explain it's a non-distressed auction, this is how it works, if you're more comfortable with a normal offer to purchase, then there's not a certain age group that necessarily will say, well, look, I'll do it, and others that say that they won't. Once you explain it properly to them, it kind of makes sense, and whichever way they want to go from there, they can.
Okay, marvelous. So ladies and gentlemen, I think that we have answered sort of most of those questions on the chat group. I want to release you. We did promise only 45 minutes. Michael, thank you very much for your part of the input. I think it's much, much harder running a webinar in front of a camera without seeing the face of your audience than standing in front of 500 people on the stage, to tell you the truth. So we appreciate you dialing in, participating tonight. Next week, we'll do one for buyers. Is this a good time to buy or not to buy in a market like this? Hopefully handling some of folks' insecurity around that. So you're more than welcome to look out for that invitation from us. And as I said, throw me an email and I'll mail you the link to this YouTube video of this recording if you'd like to have it. Thank you for participating, everyone. Really appreciate it. Have a good evening. Take care. Stay safe. Cheerio. Thanks, Mike. Stop the share.
Thanks. Cheers.